This session of Superhero University discusses the very serious issue of rape. Statistically speaking, that's something you may have experienced. Take good care and sit this one out if you need to. However, the discussion is very brief, and you can check the show notes for the timestamps to avoid. Hello, I'm Joshua Unruh, your superhero scholar. Welcome to Superhero University on Batman and Son. Session 3, Man-Bats of London. Have a seat. Class is now in session. Hello and welcome to Batman and Sons Session 3. I am very excited to bring you out of that first issue that was doing a lot of work, telling us what this story wasn't going to be anymore and setting up what it was going to be in the future. And while I definitely feel like things happened in that issue and it was an interesting and exciting read on its own merits, this is definitely where the meat of the story really gets rolling and is also several pages of nonstop action. So there's lots of stuff to unpack there, and I can't wait to get into it. But first, I want to say a small apology. Last week, I made a mistake on my end of things, and an episode of my Batman the Animated Series podcast, an animated discussion, wound up in my Superhero University feed. It wasn't a cross-promotional ploy, and you can tell because I did it with a two-parter that my co-host Caleb Masters and I didn't like very much. So it wasn't really that exciting an episode for me to use to entice you into that show unless you were really into Barbara Gordon or really kind of not great representations of artificial intelligence. But just know, if I was going to do it like on purpose to trick you into listening to that show, I definitely would have used like The Laughing Fish or something. Anyway, of course, I do recommend my own podcast if you have access to Batman the Animated Series, because that is a legitimately phenomenal piece of animation and a definitive take on this character that I clearly love very much. But for real, I'm sorry about that mistake. And I hope that it didn't disappoint anyone who saw that come up in their feed and did not get this third session. So with apologies out of the way, let's dive into Man-Bats of London. I love the titles of all of these issues, and I didn't really point out how apt Building a Better Batmobile was in the last issue. I should have, because in that issue, we really did start building a better vehicle for Batman. A story vehicle, but using his in-fiction well-known vehicle as a metaphor for that is very clever. I like it very much. And we weren't finished with it. You saw that. There was an unfinished Batmobile in the Batcave, and I think that's a metaphor for where Grant Morrison was with the first issue. We were in the process of building a better Batmobile. And to be honest, we're not there yet in this issue. I'm not sure that we're there until after Batman and Son is over. Like, at that point, the Batmobile is built. But at any rate, I love the titles. They're all very clever. I will do a better job of pointing them out. And so let's talk about Man-Bats of London. This one is not as deep as Building a Better Batmobile, but I still think it's really clever. It's a reference to the song Werewolves of London by Warren Zevon, which is itself inspired by the 1935 film Werewolf of London. Now, in this case, the were-creatures are bats, but it's the fact that there are were-beasts at all, and the setting that ties the song into it all. And it reminds us that we have no idea what kind of Batman story this is yet. Is it serious? Is it silly? Is it camp? Is it just very self-aware? I mean, my vote for what kind of Batman story this is masterpiece, but the jury is out, and this title makes sure that we know it's out. One last thing before we go into our page-by-page look. We are finally going to talk about the Pop Art Museum. Now, we are going to talk a lot more about it as the issue goes, because the art at this exhibit is actually used to comment on the plot and characters as the story rolls forward. But the one thing that was spotlighted a bit more in the previous issue that I didn't talk about then, because I think it fits thematically more here, is the upside down dinosaur. Now, if you go back and look at the previous issue, you will see that this upside down dinosaur is very prominently placed in the big establishing shot of the exhibit. But it also doesn't quite fit. I mean, it's kind of like a Godzilla-style dinosaur, so it's a piece of pop cultural ephemera, just like all of the comic book panels or fake comic book panels that get used in the art on the walls. So, I mean, it's not wildly out of place, but it really is the only sculpture that is showcased in that big establishing shot, and it's the only sculpture that is that big. That's just that huge. So I have been puzzling about this thing for literally years. I knew it had to mean something because it's so prominent and it's so incongruous with the rest of the art. But what does it mean? And why is the dinosaur Godzilla thing upside down? Well, after puzzling over this for all that time, I ran into a book called The Anatomy of Zur-En-Arrh. And I do recommend it after we get through the opus if you haven't got enough information on it for me. It's not the same thing that I'm doing, but it does take a similar deep dive into this story. And I am using the book as one of the references for this seminar. So it's definitely worth a read, and it did give me an idea of what might be going on with the upside down dinosaur. But then on top of that, I figured out something on my own that is very exciting. So now I'm going to share what it meant in the last issue flowing into the first 2/3 of this issue. Later, when we see it again, I'll talk about what else it means. But to know what it meant from last issue and moving into this issue, you have to know that there are always 3 trophies made extremely prominent in every modern comic book depiction of the Batcave. They are a giant penny, a giant Joker playing card, and a robot Tyrannosaurus Rex. Others may come and go, but these are always there. You know you're in the Batcave when you see, well, a bunch of stuff. But I would know at a glance if I saw a giant penny, a giant Joker card, and a robot T-Rex. Moving in line with the theme of who is the real man, Bruce or the Batman, the juxtaposition of these 2 images, the Tyrannosaurus Rex in the cave and the upside down dinosaur in the pop art exhibit, suggests something to me. If the Batcave is where Bruce Wayne goes to learn how to be the Batman, then this is where the Batman goes to relearn what it means to be Bruce Wayne. It's a mirror. It reflects him back on himself. Now, that explains why a giant dinosaur, but it does not explain why is it upside down, which is, I'll be honest with you, literally a thing that I was puzzling out until earlier this week before I recorded this session. But we will come back to it when we see the sculpture again, and I am very excited to tell you about that because it is frankly kind of mind-blowing. Moving into page 1, we are introduced to Jezebel Jet. Jezebel Jet is going to be a really important and major player through a lot of the opus. She's kind of a fascinating character in the way that she is both a mirror and a contrast to Bruce Wayne. She's also not the least problematic character you've ever seen. I mean, she's not the most. We are going to talk a little bit later about Ra's al Ghul and how Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams were definitely reading Fu Manchu novels when they created him. So there's certainly worse examples. But what I mean with Jezebel is that her name is very Bond girl. And also, in a way, very Wayne girl. Most of Bruce Wayne's love interests over the years have had relatively normal names. Until you get to one I mentioned in the last session, Silver St. Cloud. She was introduced during that International Batman of Mystery phase, and I don't think that's an accident. You introduce a girl with a Bond girl style name into the Batman stories when he is doing James Bond in a cape and cowl stories. I think that's on purpose. And so when we get Jezebel Jet, I think that we are supposed to see her as an extension of that thought process. We are outside of Gotham. We are jet setting. We are being an international Batman of mystery in London right now. And it wouldn't do to give Bruce Wayne a new love interest in the model of Julie Madison or Vicky Vale. We need to give him a new love interest that is at least suggested in the model of Silver St. Cloud. And so we get Jezebel Jet. Now, this is the first instance of the pop art commenting on a character. The wow marks her out, and it marks out her desirability. In a room of rich, beautiful women, Jezebel Jet stands out. And this is one of the places that I have a little bit of mixed feelings about her. I mean, she's a supermodel. They literally say later that she's a supermodel, but she's also drawn like a supermodel. And it's not the only thing that compels Bruce Wayne to get to know her better, but it is there. It's there. She couldn't just be the leader of a small African nation. She couldn't just be an heiress. She also had to be a supermodel. So, I don't know. I don't think it's the worst thing ever, but it's also clearly not the most progressive thing ever either. Similarly, when we find out that she is the leader of a small African nation, that's as far as they ever go with it. They don't say the name of it, or if they do, it's not for a long time, and I couldn't recall it. And I've read this story a few times. Most of the time, the treatment of Africa is similarly problematic. Jezebel is in charge of a nation. But most of the time when they talk about Africa, even right in this issue, the continent is treated as a homogeneous, unified place, which it very much is not, much to the detriment of its own internal politics and to global politics. And I'm not the most qualified person to speak on that subject, but I can tell you that it is demonstrably untrue that Africa is all one homogeneous unit, and it's also damaging for us here in comfortable, affluent North America to see it that way. But at the same time, we are talking about it, and we are going to see a better treatment of Africa show up much later in Batman Incorporated. So I feel like possibly some lessons were learned. And of course, you always have 22 pages of comic book, and there's a ton of stuff that has to happen here. And so maybe it just comes down to some shorthand for Jezebel and Africa. But at the same time, I just wish it were more robust, Jezebel is also the first time that we start to see that black and red juxtaposition used in the story. Now, it is not as obvious as it will become. Often, the black and red is very blood red and stark black. First, we do have her skin, which itself is not black, but we often describe people of African descent as black. We also have her name, Jet, as in the stone that is jet black. And then we have her hair, which is red. So we have that black and red set next to one another. It's going to be a while before we can talk about what we think that means, but just know here we are right away introducing that black and red motif, and we're going to see it a lot, and it is introduced to us in Jezebel Jet. Now, before we move on to page 2, I want to say I really appreciate this flirty, clever dialogue between Jezebel and Bruce. I think it's very good. I get the feeling that Bruce isn't acting as much here as he was with the other ladies. Or at least, he is acting. He's pretending to be this version of Bruce Wayne, but he's enjoying it more because of who he's acting for. I read it that he might be acting like all of us do when we first meet someone that we're attracted to. We try and put forth our best self. We're all acting then. And I feel like that's the acting that Bruce is doing here, rather than the vacuous playboy pretension that he's been doing with all the other ladies at this benefit. On page 2, we continue that conversation and we start to get more of the art commenting on the character, and the characters commenting on the art, and in the process of commenting on the art, telling us something about themselves. It's great. Bruce Wayne starts out by saying, all this comic book stuff is too highbrow for me. My God, the shade of it all. that he would say this, being a comic book character, especially after the legitimately fantastic previous issues' clockwork inner workings. Now, we also hear something about Bruce's taste in art, and I think this speaks very strongly about this version of Bruce Wayne and what we are supposed to think of him. The first thing that he mentions being a fan of is schizophrenic artists. Now, I want to say, I don't want to sound ableist here. I am trying to quickly draw together several themes, and I don't mean to describe anyone who actually suffers from schizophrenia in a bad light. But I think in terms of what we're seeing here, it is being used as a shorthand for mental illness of all types. People who don't think enough about this character often discuss Batman as being himself mentally ill. It's applying real-world logic to superhero stories, but since sanity and madness are ongoing themes in Batman stories, Morrison is making this textual. Bruce Wayne is not insane. He's sane because he's Batman. In fact, in an interview with IO9, Grant Morrison said, and I quote, "Without Batman, Bruce would be truly screwed up. But with Batman, he becomes mythic, more than human, and genuinely useful to his community. I believe he began to slay his demons the moment he became a demon." Bruce Wayne is sane because he's Batman. But he knows madness, both walking the precipice of it in himself and in staring it in the face in so much of his rogues gallery. And so because of that, he studies that madness and he appreciates it like art. Now, he also mentions tribal art. The bat shield is totemic. It is a magic sigil for Bruce Wayne that allows him, the ultimate human being, to become something more than merely a man in the mask. Just like Morrison said, it allowed him to become mythic, to become epic, to become something even more than he ever could be. And he's already the best example of us for the purposes of this superhero universe. What's more, as we move forward, we will see the bat become an actual literal tribal totem in a future issue and eventually a global corporate trademark. Bruce Wayne understands the power of totemic magic. He has harnessed it for himself, and that didn't happen by accident. He studies everything right down to tribal art. Then we have him looking at this sculpture and saying, "There's a message here somewhere. I know if I just stare hard enough." And again, I just have to say, my God, the shade of it all. It's baiting the reader. It's daring you to say that there's not more going on here than you can see on the page. It's daring you to stare hard enough and find the message. And that's why we're all here, right? So we took the bait. We took the dare. But this is also a character commentary on Bruce Wayne. He is, more than anything, a detective. He sees everything. But later in this very issue, we will see that where Bruce Wayne cannot find meaning, the Batman will impose meaning if necessary. The Joker and so many of the rest of his rogues gallery, but especially the Joker, mystifies him so much. There is no deeper meaning. There's only the madness. We also get a look at another part of his act as Bruce Wayne, this ironic cynicism, when he talks about making wealth compulsory and how so many problems would be solved if everyone were a millionaire. Now, there's a lot going on here. These words could be read as callous, a part of the Bruce Wayne jerk playboy act, except that he is also a well-known philanthropist. There is a Wayne Foundation that fights crime by day via social means, while he also fights crime by night as Batman. He is a globally known philanthropist. That's why he got an invite to this art exhibit. Jezebel would know this. And so I read these otherwise callous words as clever and flirtatious, like beneath the surface. And you can see in the final panel on this page, she's laughing at them. She gets the joke. Moving into page 3, we are introduced to the Prime Minister's wife. She will soon be like a ball in a game of keep away, so we'll come back to her a lot. But we also see that Bruce is smitten with Jezebel. He's been pretending all night that he can't use his cell phone, so he doesn't have to take numbers from all these other girls. But he wants to call Jezebel, and she's interested. But his playboy reputation is getting in the way. She doesn't need the stink of being a Wayne girl on her reputation out in the world as she tries to lead a nation and raise money for a beleaguered continent. But she's interested. She leaves with a clever quip about how all of these other girls are trying to become a part of his reputation, but not to worry, she knows where he lives. I don't want to give anything away. I said I would try very hard not to be spoilery, but let me tell you something. That is a phrase that gets real ominous many, many issues from now. Turning to pages 4 and 5, we see an escalation. The plot is about to kick into high-octane action gear. And we see this with the help of the Langstroms and Alfred. I love how incredibly over the top all of this is. Alfred is horrified to see two people just thrown out of the back of a van. It is an escalation through character reaction, which I really appreciate as a writer. And there's a really interesting visual choice. Look at the reflection in Alfred's eyes. Look at the cast shadows behind him. They're bats. And this is Alfred Pennyworth, butler to the Batman. In any other story, the silhouette of a bat descending upon him would be salvific. But here, it's quite the opposite. Page 6 and 7, we get a dramatic introduction of the threat. Giant werebats with swords smashing through windows. Also, towards the bottom of that top panel, note how the two pop art pieces combine to say, "I'm in the jungle." It's another example of the exhibits commenting on the plot. Things just got dangerous. Into our first small panel, we see that everyone is panicking except for Bruce. He's the Batman. And besides that, he is still. He is calm. He is observing clues like a detective. He immediately recognizes that it's not Kirk Langstrom. He knows what Man-Bat looks like, and that's not what these guys look like. They're not Man-Bat. They're Man-Bats. Ninja Man-Bats. At which point, Alfred shows up, once again proving to be the perfect aide-de-camp to the Batman. He is unflappable, tosses a briefcase to Bruce Wayne, we know what's in there, and then Bruce comments on Ninja Man-Bat's alarming twist. And I'm going to tell you something, that is never not hilarious to me. I love that. It's so calm, it's so collected, and yet when Batman says, that's an alarming twist, you know two things right away. It is in fact very alarming, and it is quite a twist. The man has seen alarming twists before. On page 8, we go headlong into an action scene. And it's the first one that we've had since the first 8 pages of the previous issue. I certainly never feel like it's boring or like nothing is happening. Quite a lot is happening throughout this dialogue, but Batman is an action hero, and we haven't had action in a long time, so we're going to spend the rest of this issue with almost nonstop action. But right before we get into the meat of the action, we get one more dig on the reading audience. If there's one thing I hate, it's art with no content. This is the last time I'll say it, but the shade of it all. Also, take a look at the pop art piece behind Batman. I think it's also commenting on this plot twist. It says, "The city that never sleeps." It also has reddish-orange skies, which is a way that Gotham is traditionally depicted. Even at night, it has these awful, ominous red skies. And so, you wonder, is Gotham in the form of a threat only Batman can face, following Bruce Wayne? Is that how the city never sleeps? On page 9, we have 2 short-term motifs of note. First of all, Batman is still detecting things. That will continue throughout the rest of the fight. He will continue to be a detective who picks up on clues and stays one intellectual step ahead of what's going on around him. 2, we start to see just an unexpected amount of hard-boiled language. Now, way down the road, we will have Bruce admit that he writes his casebooks in a very hard-boiled noir style to entertain Alfred. But that will also be a thing that a much younger Bruce Wayne says. And so I wonder if by this point we're led to believe that he's now in the habit of it and he just thinks that way all the time. And we get examples of both of these things right on top of each other. He notices the smell, the stink of wet carpet, dog breath, and incense. Now, 2 of those things are just man-bat things, I would think, but the incense, that it's hot and sour, I think it's suggested that he recognizes it. He has smelled that type of incense before. We'll talk about where shortly. And as far as the hard-boiled language, he says that over my shoulder, the sound of leather-bound Bibles opening and closing, wing beats. That is a thing that Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler would have written. It's great. I like that stuff. That is one of my favorite genres outside of superhero stuff. And so when it is piled on top of the superhero genre in a masterful way, I get very excited. We're going to do the countdown here. There are 6 man-bats. Boom. Then there are 5. And you can see his fist to the face of the man-bat is commented on by the pop art. Ouch. We count down 4 with the pop art saying, just a little closer. And then a close-up of it saying even bigger, just a little closer, as though the camera were narrowing down on the shot that Batman is going to take. Page 10, when he fires his grapple gun, it's the pop art behind him that gives us the blam sound effect. We also get more of that hard-boiled language. Ghosts writing on glass with broken fingernails. That is a line so good, I'm kind of mad that I didn't write it. And if you don't think so, we can just fight about it later. Now, since it's been a little while since the story did anything to remind us that every single Batman story has happened, we have a quick cameo appearance from Aunt Agatha. Aunt Agatha is Bruce's aunt. She originally made an appearance in a typically silly Silver Age story where she came to visit her sickly, wilting flower nephew Bruce and caught Bruce and Dick leaving the house in their Batman and Robin costumes. They had to lie and say they were on the way to a masquerade party. She decided to accompany them as the Joker and accidentally helps them foil a robbery. It's exactly the kind of story that you would expect for the late 50s, early 60s. However, we don't see Aunt Agatha very much, even in the comic books. But what you might be thinking of right now, and what she's sort of a prototype for, is Aunt Harriet from the Batman 66 television show. Aunt Harriet is very similar to Aunt Agatha, an elderly, aging woman who loves these boys very much, but completely misunderstands who they are and what they do with their spare time. It's also interesting that Aunt Agatha is Bruce's aunt and Aunt Harriet is Dick's aunt when she's introduced on the show. But no matter how you slice it, Aunt Harriet is on that show in order to assuage some of the gay panic that had cropped up about Batman comics after David Wortham's book, Seduction of the Innocent, which I mentioned a couple of sessions ago as being part of the House Un-American Activities crackdown on comic books being the thing that they had been for a while. Moving into page 11, if you have ever heard Lonnie Diane Rich of Chipperish Media and myself discuss action scenes on our MCU podcast, Listen Up A-Holes, you know that she hates them and is bored during them. But she and I agree that they are best when they are showing us something about the character. And that is something that I think is going on through this entire issue, not just with the pop art, but also in the way that Batman dispatches his enemies. And here's an example. He uses their greater numbers against them. He rams one into another in order to bring the count down to 3. And I think that's very telling about his character. Using the greater numbers of his enemies against them is a thing that Batman would need to get very good at very fast in the early parts of his career, or he would have had a very short career. Now, we do get a little pop art focus here, but I don't know what to make of it. They're clowns, so it makes me think Joker, although none of them really look like the Joker typically appears. And there are some reasons to talk about fools in general, as in jesters, but I can't quite tie this page together. So if any of you have a theory about a greater meaning to the clown sculpture population explosion, my ears are wide open. Lastly, on this page is when we see Batman return to the sculpture that Bruce Wayne was searching for meaning within earlier in this issue. Batman smashes the glass and takes the 2 poles that are part of the sculpture and then turns them into weapons. Where Bruce couldn't find meaning, Batman asserts it. And that is probably a metaphor for how the two air quotes personalities interact with one another. And we are down to just 2 more man-bats. And then we're down to 1 when he throws one of his makeshift weapons through its wing and sticks it to a painting. And he says, "Looks like I nailed them all." I just want to point out to you guys, Batman makes jokes. He is not a mindless vengeance engine. He is a human being who tells gallows humor jokes, just like we've seen in the best cop shows like The Wire and Homicide: Life in the Street. These people see difficult things all the time, and they deal with it through humor. Normally, that is a space that would be filled by Robin in our collective pop cultural unconscious. But here, without a Robin, Batman can make a joke, even if it's just to himself. Now, I want to point out that the Man-Bat is pinned to a Wonder Woman painting. And what I find fascinating about that is it's obviously Wonder Woman, but it is a version of Wonder Woman that could not exist within her continuity at the time. And it makes me wonder, is Morrison telling us something about how all of her stories happened too? It's barely a suggestion. We never really return to it with any characters other than Batman, but I like the suggestion that this approach to Batman is bleeding out into the wider DC universe, even if we never really get a good look at it. Lastly, we get one more nod from the pop art. Look, up in the sky. Now, much like the bat shapes reflected in Alfred's eyes and silhouetted behind him, normally that phrase would herald a heroic entrance. In this case, that's what people say when they see Superman. But here, where everything's all topsy-turvy, it's death from above. Page 13, we see another example of the way Batman fights. He knows his enemy. He knows that light and noise will throw these ninja man-bats off their game. We are also reminded that the Prime Minister's wife exists, because there she is. She's going to keep being important. We won't know why for a minute. Moving into page 14, we see that the Prime Minister's wife is afraid of Batman. They don't know him in London, and that lack of knowledge is working against him. Batman has been trapped in Gotham for so long that the world at large has forgotten about him. He doesn't stop to notice it here, but eventually Bruce Wayne will see that as a problem and he will address the hell out of it with Batman Incorporated. Now, looking in the back of that panel though, I see that pop art of the fist raised with the starburst background as a triumphant symbol. And I think I'm supposed to, because we get reintroduced to it on Batman very shortly. We flash over to Alfred still being amazing in the clutch. Batman is in there fighting for his life and the lives of everybody, and in the meantime, his aide-de-camp is making sure everybody just gets the hell out of the door. But you'll also tell that one of the people who's escaping is talking about how one of them is attacking the others. They are mistaking Batman for a man-bat. And it's similar to the Prime Minister's wife being afraid of Batman. And it harkens back to a couple of different eras in the Dark Knight Detective's history. When he first burst on the scene in 1939, he was described as a weird creature of the night. That appellation was used often until Robin became part of the equation and the tenor of the stories changed. Not as much as they would change when we got to the Comics Code Authority in the 50s, but things were different once Robin showed up and we were no longer trafficking as an actual monster scaring criminals. No more weird creature of the night. But it also harkens back to an interesting editorial edict that lasted through definitely the 90s very strongly and into the 2000s. And it's one that I kind of enjoy as a concept, but I don't think it actually works the more it plays out. And what I'm talking about is after Denny O'Neil became the editor-in-chief of the Bat offices, he declared that the DCU at large thought that the Batman was an urban legend. That people did not believe that there was an actual Batman. That most civilians believed the bat signal was a trick that the Gotham City Police Department used to keep a lid on crime. I really love that idea for about the first year or two of Batman's career, but after that, it just stops making any sense. The guy gets his picture taken with the Justice League. The jig is up. He's out there. Urban legend time is over. But I think that's what we're calling back to, is these different moments when people didn't know what to make of the Batman, when they thought he was just as monstrous as the creatures or villains he fought. We also see that Jezebel Jet notices things. She realizes that two people are definitely still stuck in there, the Prime Minister's wife and Bruce Wayne. She is formidable, and so no wonder that Bruce is smitten by her, even though he doesn't know her well. Game is recognizing game. There are only three people in this entire situation who are calm. They are Batman, Alfred, and Jezebel Jet, and that is interesting. Page 15. Batman is assuring the Prime Minister's wife that he can save her. His internal monologue says that he's not as sure in his own mind as he sounds when he talks to her, but he has to keep appearances up. He is there for her. And that's very heroic. I think that says something about his character. He wants this woman to feel like she's protected. He puts up a strong front for her because she's the civilian and he's the guy who does the superheroing. We also get two little bits of pop art. We have the one declaring incoming as we get a whole new wave of Ninja Man-Bats. And we also, in the final panel, get a callback to that triumphant fist when Batman's own fist is punching out of the mass of Man-Bats. Moving into page 16 and 17, I really appreciate the wry observation, or maybe ironic observation of, this is new. It's also a backwards commentary on all those years of Batman stories when he was forced into the box of being this street-level detective and vigilante. This isn't new. He's seen worse than this. He's been a part of worse than this. But this is new after a while. As you read, you see that Batman sacrifices himself to take out the largest group of Man-Bats. He doesn't die, he's not incapacitated, but he is hurt, he's wounded, and he's tired. This is a very serious fight right now. We see that this otherwise supreme crime fighter is really being pushed to his limit by sheer numbers. Remember, Batman is incredibly dangerous, but only to those who would hurt others. He saves people even at the expense of himself. We also get a return of that hard-boiled language. From 2 stories below me comes a sound like a 21-gun salute. Those are brittle bat bones breaking against a 20-foot-tall pop art snapshot of a bad migraine. Now, I'm appreciating that because I already admitted I am a big fan of hard-boiled and noir fiction, but I wonder if this is also to just keep us in mind of that every story happened. Grant Morrison is blowing the lid off, and we're going to do big superhero stuff, but he's not forgetting who Batman has been these last several years, even if he's surpassing it. And as we see the Prime Minister's wife escaping the mayhem, screaming, "Help me, somebody help me," we know this isn't over. Page 18. Batman is overwhelmed. He can be beaten, at least momentarily. Remember that as we move into the next stories, The Black Glove and R.I.P. He can be beaten, but he is also a man who always has plans. Notice that he makes mention of going through plans A, B, C, and D. Sure, they are improvised, but at the same time, he is planning. This isn't just a wild brawl. He is making plans to survive it, to overcome it, and to save people in the process. Now here we see him falling and slamming head first into that giant upside down dinosaur in glass. This is the other way that I knew this dinosaur meant something. It reappears in this action scene, and it could have been anything. It could have just been a column holding up the ceiling, but no, it's a giant dinosaur upside down in glass. Now, I stand by the inversion of the Tyrannosaurus Rex from the Batcave, but I think here we get something else also. Something that I have had such a good time researching this week, and I'm going to be honest with you, I'm fascinated by the topic and will be looking at it deeper, and that is the Tarot. Now, Grant Morrison is himself a chaos magician. I cannot tell you what that means to his life exactly, but I know that his worldview, his belief system centers on the idea that he is a chaos magician, that he can tap into the greater powers of the universe. He has talked about how he used certain comic books as spells that he was casting out into the world, knowing that many, many eyes would see them and many minds would think about them. I feel like this is a gentleman who is probably pretty familiar with the tarot deck. And in fact, if you go back to a lot of his earlier work, you see that there is a card he is particularly fond of, the Hanged Man. Now, for those of you not familiar with tarot, these are the cards that you often see, especially in like Victorian fiction, that people are using to read the future or tell the fortune of someone. For our purposes here, I'm going to dial in specifically on this card, the Hanged Man. It depicts the Fool, who is kind of the character that moves through the tarot deck. It almost tells a story. The 0 card is the Fool, and when we get to the Hanged Man, it is the Fool depicted hanging upside down, but with a halo-style glow around his head. So he is hung upside down from the rest of the world, but he is enlightened in the process. I want to refer you to learntarot.com, is where I got a lot of this information, but I also spoke with my co-writer, Daniel Swenson, who is much more knowledgeable on the subject of tarot than I am, and he's the one who pointed me in this direction and got me on the right track, and I really appreciate it. Hi, Dan. Thanks a lot. Those of you who are listening, if you're not aware, Dan writes fiction with me at EmpireCityAdventures.com, and you should also read his stunning fantasy novel, Orison. But to return to the Hanged Man, I quote from LearnTarot.com. Undaunted, the Fool pushes on. He is determined to realize his vision, but he finds life is not so easily tamed. Sooner or later, he encounters his personal cross, an experience that seems too difficult to endure. This overwhelming challenge humbles him until he has no choice but to give up and let go. At first, the Fool feels defeated and lost. He believes he has sacrificed everything, but from the depths, he learns an amazing truth. He finds that when he relinquishes his struggle for control, everything begins to work as it should. By becoming open and vulnerable, the Fool discovers the miraculous support of his inner self. He learns to surrender to his experiences rather than fighting them. He feels a surprising joy and begins to flow with life. And just running down a list of things, that card can mean accepting what is, surrendering to experience, ending the struggle, being vulnerable and open, giving up control, giving up urgency, living in the moment, waiting for the best opportunity, being a martyr, putting self-interest aside, going 1 step back to go 2 steps forward, giving up for a higher cause, and putting others first. But most of all, what the Hanged Man can mean is winning by losing. This is a battle that Batman is not winning. He is being overwhelmed by numbers. And so, in this moment, he chooses, I think, to make a purposeful misstep that leaves him vulnerable in order to end this battle that he was going to lose and move on to the next one where he might have another better chance at winning. And notice that we wake up in a cave. It is in the depths that the Fool discovers the miraculous support of his inner self. Now, you may think that I'm stretching a little bit right now. Just know we are going to see the strength of Bruce Wayne's inner self manifested as Batman come back again and again and again throughout the opus. Which is why when I stumbled on this description of the Fool, I finally felt like I understood what this upside-down dinosaur was doing. On page 19, even here, Batman is the consummate detective. Only to the Batman could a small army of ninja man-bats be just playing, and only with Talia al Ghul could such a thing be merely an opening gambit. And as Batman is held at sword point by the man-bats, we notice the Prime Minister's wife has also been kidnapped. Turning on to page 20, we are finally fully introduced to Talia al Ghul. So let me tell you a little bit about her. She originally appeared in Detective Comics number 411 in 1971 as the daughter of eco-terrorist and immortal criminal mastermind, Ra's al Ghul. Ra's chose Batman as his heir and insisted that Bruce and Talia marry so that Batman could carry on Ra's work. Batman refused, of course, because, worldwide criminal empire, but he and Talia held romantic feelings for one another for many decades in real life. In their own internal chronology, who knows? But since 1971, she has been one of Batman's most prominent and recurring romantic interests. Her place within that continuity has drifted from pawn caught between these two powerful men to eventually being treated as a more formidable adversary in her own right. And this version of Talia takes all of that into account because, remember, all the stories happened. And it brings her to a place where she has taken her father's place fully as the leader of his vast criminal enterprise. And she is now ready to commit to Batman, though still only on her own terms. But will Batman commit to her? We'll see at the end of this story, Batman and Son, how that plays out. In the meantime, there is a really fun character beat between Batman and Talia. Whenever they run into each other, they will humorously remind one another just how normal they and their relationship are not. In this instance, it's Bruce pointing out that she is the kind of girl who receives a secret underground lair in London sewers for her 16th birthday. And Talia gets confused. Her life is so weird that for a moment, she can't remember for which birthday she received the vast subterranean lair. Next time they come face to face, it will be Talia reminding Bruce how ridiculous his life is. Keep an eye out for that in the last issue of Batman and Son. Now you see Batman make the assumption that Talia is just going forward with Raish's work. But she makes it clear, Ra's al Ghul is dead. This is my very own little magnum opus. She is doing something that neither her father nor her lover could possibly fathom. It will be spectacular. I mentioned in both the previous seminars that there is a story from 1987 called The Son of the Demon that has Batman willing to work with Ra's briefly. And during that time, he is actually married to Talia. They conceive. She fakes a miscarriage and gives the child away to an orphanage. We get a glimpse of just part of that story here when she talks about that night she and Batman shared under the desert moon above the Tropic of Cancer. Now, you'll note that right away, in the very next page, Batman contradicts that and claims that he was drugged in a demented eugenics scheme. Who are we supposed to believe? I think we're pretty obviously supposed to believe Batman. He is our hero. He is the detective. Details matter to him. And so I think we are to believe that he was, in fact, drugged and used. Now, what does that use mean? That is a really interesting question because you'll note that we are edging right up to discussing Batman as a rape victim. I have very complicated feelings about that I am not going to get into in this session, other than to say using rape as a plot device on women is lazy. It is the kind of thing that will make me tune out of a story, both because it is so legitimately horrendous an act, but also because I know at that point the writer is out of ideas. I don't need to hear anything else from this person. They have made the laziest choice. But our hero, our male hero, who is the peak perfect human being in a superhero universe, treated as a rape victim, is very fertile and interesting ground. We don't really do a whole lot with it in this story, I'll just tell you, which is also part of my mixed feelings about it. If we're going to do it, let's really do it. But at least for the purposes of this narrative, I think we are supposed to believe Bruce Wayne's remembrance of events, even though Talia's remembrance is closer to the story that I read way back in 1987, right down to the fact that she is not in her memory kissing Bruce Wayne. He still has his cowl on. She's making love only to the Batman. Now, I think something bigger and mythological is also going on with Talia here. Obviously, we've dealt with that a little bit with Batman, and we are going to deal with it a lot more throughout the rest of this story as we see just how much his totemic power as the Bat affects the world around him. But I think something similar is being done with Talia. I think she is being compared to Lilith. Lilith is a character out of Hebrew and later adopted Christian mythology. I'm going to give you the high points that I think are important for Talia, but just know, as a mythological construct, Lilith is complicated and there are inconsistencies with how she's portrayed across centuries and across different pieces of literature. But here are the high points. Lilith was Adam's first wife, made by God from the same earth as Adam. But when she refused to be subservient to Adam, and there are often connotations of sexual activity in that she would not lay beneath him, that she would be above him and not have him above her. When she refuses that subservience, she leaves the Garden of Eden and refuses to return. Through some more of the story that I don't need to get into, she becomes a mother of demons, a thief of children, and is something of a succubus, causing men to succumb to their lust through a magic spell, and then leaving them unable to be satisfied by mortal women. As I mentioned, Talia is the daughter of Ra's al Ghul. His name literally means the demon's head. The demon is the name of his vast global criminal enterprise. He is literally the head of that organization and the head of the demon. But with his death, Talia has moved from being the daughter of the demon to the mother of the demon. She will no longer lay subservient to either Ra's, who probably for this purpose stands in the place of God, nor will she be subservient to Bruce, her Adam. If we believe Bruce Wayne's account of the eugenics experiment, then he was heavily drugged, which might be a way of talking about Talia as Lilith putting him under a spell and, air quotes, stealing a child from him. Lilith is also often a murderess of babies or children and usually takes them in their sleep. Now, it will be a long while before that part comes home to roost, but when it does, you will not be able to miss it. I will make sure to point it out to you when we get there. Now, whether this is true or not, Talia certainly believes that Batman could no longer be satisfied with anyone else, just like Lilith would ruin mortal men on mortal women. And lastly, the man-bats with their glowing eyes and hideous faces and leathery wings have a very demonic aspect, and they swarm around Talia in a very protective way, and she appears to be very motherly to them. And she promises that she will make more, just as Lilith is said to give birth to 100 demons a day. Now again, if you think that I'm reaching a little bit like the dinosaur, just know there's more stuff to come that I'm trying to leave largely unspoiled that will support Talia as Lilith. But she's clearly supposed to be operating on a much higher level than just some crime lord, because she's going toe-to-toe with the Batman and has him at her mercy right now. On page 21, Talia talks about the child that she, again, air quotes, stole from Bruce Wayne. She describes him as the boy and how he is growing beyond even her control. And my personal favorite line requires discipline in the hand of a great man. Now, remember, at this point, Talia hates Ra's and I think is right on the cusp of hating Bruce. So I definitely read that line as though she were delivering it with a smirk. And I think that's backed up by the fact that the next thing she says is, "Don't let him cramp your style." We'll come to see that part of her larger plan is to keep Batman busy by giving him this handful of a child to keep track of, which is when on page 22, we are finally and fully introduced to Damian. And we are introduced to him with a sword to his father's throat and a snarky comment about how he expected Batman to be taller, which we can read as greater, as more, as something better than this thing that he is, trapped by monsters and forced to kneel at his mother's feet. Any compassion that we had for Damian as he seemed frightened and hesitant of meeting his father is instantly erased by what a magnificent little bastard he is. And let me tell you, in next issue, that will only intensify. I can tell you from my own experience, I hated him immediately, but it didn't really solidify into loathing until the next issue. So, in closing, I think we can say with this issue, the setup is over and the story, both the small story of Batman and Son and the larger story of the opus, is now in full speed ahead. The suggestions of themes have become actual themes. We have had the dichotomy of Bruce Wayne and Batman thrown into stark relief. We have seen the discussion of nature or nurture brought right to the forefront with Damian. He's been raised by an international league of assassins, so he's damned by his nurture, but he is also the child of an obsessive-compulsive world-class crime fighter and an immortal criminal mastermind. His nature is not looking in good shape either. Speaking of Damien, he changed everything about the Bat books. He was the sensational character find of 2006, even if most of us didn't know it, and if we did, we didn't like it. Last, and a thing that I really didn't see until the last couple of readings of this, and this is a big theme. We're going to see it a lot in Batman and Son, but then it becomes something that hovers in the background, floating in and out of focus as we go. But we really see the beginning of a contest now between the ultimate man in Bruce Wayne and a fully actualized woman in Talia al Ghul. The fully actualized woman will shift sometimes, but usually maintain that connection to Talia that lets them be a surrogate for her in that confrontation. It's fascinating. There is a lot going on in this book that is mostly a giant action scene. And that, friends, is why I love this opus so much and why I wanted to share it with all of you. And I feel like that brings us to the close of this session. I am wide open for more conversations about anything that I have covered in this session or any of the previous sessions about Batman. And I am most active on Twitter, so you can find me easily enough at Joshua Unruh. Now remember, Superhero University is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions. So please join me for Session 4, Wonderboys. Until then, we'll see you back here. Same bat time, same bat channel.